part 3 of my drone build, we are going to be installing our 4 ESCs. In part 2, we put on all our motors, and now we're doing the ESCs. As you can see, I've already opened one of them up. So here we have the main input. This is ground, this is positive. So the battery voltage is going to be sent through this wire. Over here we have the 3 wires leading to the brushless motors. And over here we have a ground and signal wire. So the signal wire is going to be plugged into our flight controller. It's going to tell the ESC how much amperage it should give to the motors, which will tell it how much speed it's going to give. So, yeah, anyway, some other stats on it. It's obviously 30 amps, which is pretty good. That's continuous, 40 amps burst. There's no BEC inside of it, so for the signal wire, I think it has to be operated on 5 volts, so we're going to have to figure that out. And it runs 2 to 6S, so that's really, really good. They were $8 a piece on hobbyking.com, that's in US dollars. So I guess now we're just going to do some soldering and get the rest of these opened up. Get them attached to the motors and the power distribution board. So right now my soldering iron is heating up because we're going to be doing some soldering in a second here. But as you can see on these ESCs, we have quite a bit of length of wire that go to our motors, and there's also more wire on the motors here. And obviously it's not very practical to connect it like this. You can, but it also has a little bit more weight and it just adds clutter. So what I'm going to be doing is, for example, in this ESC I've removed some of the coating here, and I'm going to be desoldering these little pads, or these wires, pulling them off, and then directly soldering the motor wires to the pads on the ESC. It should be simple with no difficulties. We just have to make sure not to heat up the ESC too much, otherwise we may risk burning it out. And of course, for the ones that still have this little piece of plastic on there, I'm just going to cut it out with my X-Acto knife very carefully. So I've cleaned off the tip of my soldering iron with some solder. I'm going to add just a little tiny bit there, and then just go into these wires on the end of the ESC, rub it in, pull out at the same time. It also helps to have some of this sticky tack stuff around. I'm just going to pull off a little piece there. That's going to keep it in place while you're doing your work. There we go. I finally got the first one. Now I just need to do the rest of them. Alright, so now I have all the wires detached from the ESC. They're over here. We're probably going to use these wires eventually. They may be a little bit thick of a gauge for this kind of small wiring, but hey, maybe it'll come to use. But now I'm going to move on to attaching our motor wires to our ESCs. But there's one catch. All these motors I bought move counterclockwise in this direction when hooked up straight with the motor wires. Now if we move it in the forward orientation here, I explained in the last part, these are motors 1, 2, 3, and 4. And motors 2 and 3 actually move counterclockwise because of the way the props are. And for these ones I still move clockwise. So essentially what I'm saying is that these two motors are hooked up straight, but for these two we're going to switch over 2 of the wires. We're going to cross them, and that's going to switch the direction. So instead of them moving clockwise, they're going to move counterclockwise. You only want to switch 2 of the motors, not 3. Don't mix it up too much, otherwise it'll screw it up. But it's pretty simple. Yeah, you just switch over some of the wires for the counterclockwise motors. So now, as you can see, I have all the ESC soldered up to the motors correctly across the wires. Motors 2 and 3, going to mention that again just because maybe a lot of people will screw that up. But now we're going to be attaching our ground and our positive main battery voltage to here, as well as our signal wire and the other ground. But as you can see, we have a lot of slack here. We might be making a mess. I want this to be clean, so So I'm going to stuff each of these ESCs into their little place in the arms, fold these wires over like so on the top, and then put a zip tie, or two maybe, through the hole and above, and then we'll go on from there. And after doing that little bit of zip tying, it looks a lot more clean. I just love how the wire overlaps over there. It just makes it look like a beast of a machine. And custom me, whatever. I don't really know if it makes it look ugly or not, but I like it so far. So right now we're going to be trimming our ground, our main power, our signal, and other powering ground. We're going to be hooking them up to the power distribution board right here, so you can see the little labels. So right there we have our main ground, which is negative. Then we have signal, which is the wiggly one, if you can see that. Then we have positive for our main voltage. And then our other ground here, the other black wire next to the signal one, is going to be connected to the negative one as well. So let's pop to that. But of course, before we do that, silly me, we have to pre-tin the power distribution board for these lines. So I'm just going to pull it out right there, and then do all of those 3 pads for each ESC. I got all those pads nicely pre-tinned. I'm going to slide the board back in, figure out my lengths, and then cut all of the wires. Alright, so now all the wires are cut to pretty appropriate length. They may be a little bit short, some of them, but I did give extra slack for most of it, for the most part. Anyhow, now it's time to strip the wires using my fingernails, or I have these wire strippers over here, and then after that I will pre-tin them and then solder them up to the pads. And check out how clean this looks right now. Look at those joins. Some of them are a little bit messy, but overall, I think I did a pretty good job, especially this one. Take a look at that. So anyway, in the next part, we are going to be mounting our flight controller inside of this stack right here. It's going to be mounted upwards, but I'm just going to save those details for the next part of the build. So far, it looks really, really cool.